Testing.
Yep, you're good. Hear you.
We're back on. Mr. Kushner, you had the request for the 15 minutes to get your instruction.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize that that took a little longer than I had expected, and I appreciate the indulgence. We did have an opportunity to seek instructions from our client. Without getting into details, because obviously this is off the record, without prejudice, we do not have instructions to engage in the proposal that Mr. Streisfield put to us this morning. We did get instructions to consider an alternative proposal, which I've discussed with Mr. Streisfield. I understand he needs to get instructions. What we suggested to him, which I understand is agreeable, is that we start with the evidence from the city's parking panel now, when their examination in chief is concluded, we might take a little bit of a longer break than we otherwise would to enable Mr. Streisfield to obtain instructions on what I put back to him. And if he can't get instructions on that, we would then carry on with whatever Mr. Streisfield wanted to discuss with the panel.
That agreeable? Yes or no?
Sorry, I'm just turning my mic on. Am I on? Thank you. Yes, that is agreeable. And so that the panel is aware, what's behind these instructions is a request to have an emergency settlement meeting. That's the bottom line. And therefore, that's what we need time for.
That's after the evidence of this panel, is that correct?
Yes. Because all that's going to happen is that this panel is just going to give their evidence in chief. And
that's maybe your view, but we're going to proceed with the hearing on in any event. Okay. Mr. Kushner?
Well,
I thought you agreed with Mr. Kushner as the proceedings, so can we get on with it?
I did agree with him on that, but if you recall, before we had the break, I had a number of matters that I have not been able to deal with. And certainly one of them relates to the exhibit and the exhibit list. I have a list of matters that require attention. So I just want to be able to deal with those first before we move forward.
No, I thought that was to be the list of issues has been decided. That's exhibit 13. And I thought everything was going to be carved out or settled in that line. And I thought we just suggested, and it was agreed, that we would proceed to hear this panel, and then we would have the pause.
I have one particular matter that I wanted to address simply by way of clarification. I would think that if you allow me to say what I have to say, it will be regarded as friendly, perhaps friendly clarification.
Is this something that should be addressed or considered by Mr. Kushner and or Mr. Tahar if it relates to anything on the list of witnesses and or, as I say, the list of issues have been decided? So could you not deal with it at the same time as you deal with the pause after the panels?
I know
Yeah,
it at this particular time, I'm just dealing with the exhibit list. I just have a comment with respect to the exhibit list that has been, I want to understand that, first of all, that a copy was handed up to the tribunal this morning, and I wanted to make some submissions with respect to the exhibit list before we proceed.
well, Exhibit 13 was submitted yesterday, and that's the issues list that we're aware of. We haven't had any adjusted issues list.
I'll say, with the greatest respect, sir, as I understand it, the exhibit list was handed up to you, or should have been exhibit list, not an
No.
issues list, or an exhibit list.
Well, we have a list of exhibits.
Okay, so I'm not talking about issues list, I'm talking about the exhibit list.
Okay, what's the issue on the exhibits list?
Thank you. So the issue on the exhibit list is this. Exhibit 2 as I understand it, or I need clarification from this tribunal, whether in fact Exhibit 2 is really an exhibit in this proceeding anymore, in view of the replaced exhibits, which would start at Exhibit 10, excuse me, Exhibit 18, Exhibit 19, Exhibit 20, Exhibit 21, Exhibit 22, Exhibit 23, Exhibit 24, Exhibit 25, Exhibit 26, Exhibit 27. In other words, is Exhibit 2 removed from this hearing? That's the first thing. The second thing is, I do not see in any of the redacted statements a redacted version of the city's planner's witness statement. Is that in this material? Is there a redacted statement for this from the city's planner in this?
That's the question you raised. We'll get Mr. Kushner to address it shortly. So you got two questions. Is 2 still stand? And is the planner's witness statement redacted? Is that it?
One more. Exhibit 28. Exhibit 28 says NEC visual evidence comprised of 3 tabs. You see that? And it says that if you follow it, it says that in fact that it was filed by North Elgin Center, NEC, on July 6th. You see that? Problem with this exhibit is that it does not in fact contain a sub-exhibit from that exhibit, which is the handwritten notations made specifically by Dan Chershevsky on 2 pages from Exhibit 28. And those need to be taken out or marked separately from that exhibit.
We got the drift of that. Okay, thank you. Mr. Kushner.
Mr. Chair, with respect to Exhibit 2, our submission is that the document should remain an exhibit for purposes of the hearing, so that we have the benefit of seeing exactly what was redacted in relation to the original versions of each of the witness statements. The city has undertaken that examinations in chief will be confined to what's contained in the redacted versions, but I think for record-keeping purposes, it would be important and helpful to keep the actual original witness statements as an exhibit for record-keeping purposes going forward. With respect to the redacted versions of Ms. Anderson's 2 witness statements, Ms. Anderson is actually undertaking that as we speak. Our hope and expectation is that we'll be able to circulate the redacted versions of her witness statements later today or this evening at the latest, prior to her examination, which at this point is almost certain not to happen until tomorrow. As far as the description of the exhibit, I'm in your hands. I have no comment on that.
Well, it's the latter one. I guess we can add the 2 sheets, which I think is page 1 and page 4 or something of exhibit 28 as the next exhibit, as amended or as corrected or as dealt with by Mr. T.
Mr. Chairman, would Mr. Streisfield please circulate copies of those to the other parties via email would be great, and end of day is fine.
Okay.
And sir, Mr. Chairman, it's Ira Kagan here. Since I'm the one with carriage of the exhibit list, and I don't want to create a problem, I'm going to ask Mr. Streisfield to email everybody his preferred description of what Exhibit 30 should be. And if any of us object, we can have a little debate about it privately, and otherwise I will update the exhibit list accordingly.
Okay. Fair enough.
Thank you. Also, I have a problem with the description of Exhibit 29. This is not the description of. That is an inaccurate description of what Exhibit 29 actually is. So.
Excuse me, sir, that is how I stated it in hearing yesterday. I'm pressing it.
Yeah, again, it's Mr. Kagan. I wrote this word for word, what Ms. Burton said. And then I asked Mr. Kahar to confirm for me what the base document was, and he sent me the info.
I lost him.
I'm sorry. So I wrote down word for word the exhibit name as Member Burton described it. And then I asked Mr. Kahar to confirm for me what the base document was that the witness wrote on. And he sent me this information that it was Exhibit 1H, tab 33, page 2535. So Mr. Streisfield, if I've made an error, I don't know what it is.
What was the base document?
Schedule 4 of the secondary plan.
And since the witness was making his own handwritten notes on Schedule 4, which is the street schedule, it could not be a sketch from memory on where a ring road would be if he's doing a sketch on.
Let me suggest, Mr. Streisfield, that you
Those
can
were
do
the-
this.
those-
Sorry, Mr. Kagan, hang on a minute. You can solve that issue outside of the hearing. We're going to deal with Exhibit 2 is going to stand as is for the purposes of the record, as Mr. Kushner has already said. Exhibit 3, Anderson's redacted, is coming, and you'll have that. So work the other out, and we're going to proceed to hear the panel.
So can I just confirm that 30 is now the 2 sheets from Dan Cherchevsky's handwritten notes on Exhibit 28? Exhibit
Sir,
30.
Mr. Streisfield, I'm holding a note in the exhibit list that 30 is what you tell us it's going to be. And then if we object to what you tell us, we'll have a private discussion. So I'm not writing anything more down for you right now on number 30. I have a note on 30 that says, wait for Jeff's description. And I don't want to type what you tell me, because when I did when I typed word for word what Ms. Burton told me the description of Exhibit 29 was, you'll see I start the quotation with the word quick. That's word for word her voice, what she said. You're telling me I got it wrong. So with the greatest respect, sir, I'm not writing down anything you say. I'm going to copy and paste from your email.
Work it out. That's it. We're going to proceed to hear the panel now. Oh, Mr. Streisfield, we've had enough of the issues. We've decided on 2, and the redacted Anderson is coming, and figure out.
Right. I'm just saying there's a placeholder. It's 2 sheets, and that's what Exhibit 30 is. We'll sort that out later. Okay.
Work it out.
Yep.
Mr. Kushner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It'll be Mr. Kahar who's leading this panel once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Mr. Chai and Mr. Dahl. We're going to be working from Exhibit 24, 25, 26, and 27. That's Mr. Chai's witness and reply witness statement as redacted, as well as Mr. Dahl's witness and reply witness statement as redacted. Mr. Chair, before I go any further, I'll pause for a moment to have the witnesses sworn in.
Prefer to be sworn or to affirm?
Sworn.
Sworn?
Sworn.
You have a. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Kahar, do we have an redacted or updated witness statement for?
Madam
I
Chair,
am.
that's correct. Yeah, we had provided those yesterday. They should be somewhere up there. I appreciate there's lots of paper up there. They look like this. They're loose documents.
Thank you.
You said 24 to 27 inclusive.
That's correct. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to confirm that Mr. Dahl was also sworn in. Not sure, I might have missed that.
Oh, no, he was not. It's a panel.
I'm sorry. Mr. Chai, do you prefer to be sworn or to affirm?
Sworn is fine.
Could you take a holy book in your hand? Pretend you have one.
You can do this, right?
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you. So in accordance with the tribunal's direction, I can advise as it relates to Mr. Chai, his CV begins at page 234, 235 of his redacted witness statement, Exhibit 24. And at attachment B is his signed acknowledgement of expert's duty, page 242 of Exhibit 24. And as it relates to Mr. Chai, I'm going to be seeking to qualify him to provide expert evidence in the area of the technical aspects related to parking and transportation demand management. I'd ask if there are any objections from the parties as to his qualifications. If none, then I'll proceed with my request to the tribunal. If so, then I would like to go further through his evidence. So I'll pause for that.
Any issues with the qualifications of either proposed witnesses?
And Mr. Chair, as it relates to Mr. Dahl, I'm going to be asking for him to be qualified to deal with the policy aspects of parking and transportation demand management, to provide expert evidence in that area. And his CV and signed acknowledgement of expert's duty are contained within Exhibit 26. Page 284 for the CV and 287 for the signed acknowledgement of expert's duty.
Any issue with any of the qualifications, either the qualifications of either of those two witnesses? Now. None? Mr. Tahar, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to commence with questions for Mr. Dahl. And Mr. Dahl, I'm hoping you can provide the tribunal some history regarding the existing parking policy and regulations that exist in the city and any forthcoming parking policies and regulations.
Of course. So currently the city of Richmond Hill recognizes the Richmond Hill Parking Strategy Final Draft Report, June 2010, which was developed by HDR and iTrans. This was created to serve as a parking policy document with clearly defined parameters, applicability, and a framework for parking standards and requirements throughout the city, both now and in the foreseeable future. One of the key principles in its development was the land use intensification investments and rapid transit are conducive to lower auto usage and lower vehicle ownership. The parking requirements developed within that report reflect this by establishing lower minimum parking standards and maximums for certain areas and corridors. Specifically, the 2010 parking strategy established parking rates for key development areas, which included the Yonge and Bernard KDA, which are lower than other areas within Richmond Hill. Specifically, we were 20 to 30% lower than the parking requirements at the time of its writing. And within the document known as the rates which apply for the rest of Richmond Hill, it's 20 to 30% lower. This is reflected within the rental and condominium apartment rates compared to the generic rates applied to the rest of Richmond Hill within the KDA. And the parking rates within KDAs are the second lowest within this 2010 strategy, second only to the Richmond Hill Regional Center, which is located at Yonge Street and Highway 7, where future subway service will occur. Also, Richmond Hill Center is a major bus terminal where you have multiple GO Transit routes from the 407, multiple Viva busway routes, and in general, that's where the core of development will happen in the future. Acknowledging that this report is now 10 years old, the city recently authorized and has commenced an update to this report known as the 2020 Parking and TDM Strategy for New Developments. The city has retained HDR as well to undertake this update. Preliminary findings from this report have informed the parking rates within the Yonge and Bernard KDA zoning bylaw. It should also be noted that the 2010 parking strategy did recommend pursuing TDM, which is transportation demand management strategies, but did not make specific recommendations beyond the inclusion of a shared parking formula, which would be reductions associated to multiple land uses within a single development. The recommended TDM strategy within the recommended TDM strategy is included as part of the scope of the 2020 parking and TDM strategy for new developments. And so that hopes to pursue that recommendation from the 2010 report. The timing of completion for this 2020 parking and TDM strategy for new developments has been impacted due to COVID-19, just because currently, needless to say, there's a bit of a difference in typical travel patterns and behaviors as a result of COVID-19, and resultingly the parking behaviors of people and their general behavior of how they travel, when they travel, how often they travel has changed and is generally atypical. The city is committed to continuing work on this project to further refine the parking rates and TDM components, acknowledging that there is a need to support the goals of the policy areas within the city. I'll go into more details about this parking strategy and how it feeds into the development of the secondary plan further within my testimony.
So Mr. Dahl, beginning in 2017 and to date, what has happened with the secondary plan and zoning bylaw as it relates to parking regulations and parking policy?
Sure. November 20th, 2017, the Yonge and Bernard KDA secondary plan and zoning bylaw were adopted by City Council. The adopted instruments contained sections identifying applicable parking requirements and TDM goals. The parking rates contained within that zoning bylaw were consistent with those in the 2010 parking strategy. I can specifically go to those sections and share my screen if I may. Once I get them open, please bear with me.
And Mr. Chair, all of these documents that I anticipate the witness is going to go to are in the joint document book. They're going to be put up on the shared screen so everyone's got access to them. And I just asked the witness to identify the tab number at which the document is available.
Yes, of course. So the zoning bylaw, the 2017 zoning bylaw is tab 27. I'll be referring to page 28 or table 5.14.1. And then the 2010 parking strategy is provided as tab 70, and I'll be turning to page 27 of that document. We're going to try a picture-in-picture setup. See how this goes. So the 2010 parking strategy is on the left of my screen. You'll see me scrolling down to the appropriate section. So you can see here, the parking standards start at section 4.2, and then specifically 4.2.1 is for the downtown local center and for key development areas. And then if you continue scrolling, you'll see the beginning of this table. Recognizing that a lot of these terms have changed over the years from 2010 to 2017, and the numbers aren't in the exact order. I'll just point out a few. So you can see the condominium apartment rates. In general, those are just called apartment rates within the zoning bylaw. And you can see going down from bachelor to 3-bedroom, those go 0.8, 0.9, 1, and 1.2. And you can see those numbers reflected in table 5.14.1 in the 2017 zoning bylaw. Likewise, the rental rates of 0.75, 0.85, 1, and 1.2 are also reflected within this table. I'll move on to commercial just to show a couple here. So major office at 2 is reflected in this table, office at 2. Other commercial here, which is for larger and smaller areas, are 4 and 3 respectively. Those are just noted as neighborhood and regional centers. I'm not going to go through every single value. I just wanted to show that this is where those numbers and recommendations came from. The secondary plan from 2017, which is tab 26, if you'd like to follow along, was also stated the goal of transportation demand management in order to reduce travel by decreasing the need for travel, shifting travel away from single occupant vehicles and peak period travel. This is consistent with the 2010 parking strategy did recommend to pursue TDM, and so this was an attempt to do so. Subparagraph 5 within that document went on to note the requirements of a TDM strategy be completed for each development to the city's satisfaction, and it listed 16 sample items. I'm actually going to flip to that document as well, just to show generally where the section is in the strategy so that I can show what was updated afterwards. So again, that's tab 26, and I'll share my screen in a moment. So starting on this page, section 12.4.3, transportation demand management. You can see there's a number of items here. Those are generally high level on introducing certain facilities on site. And then section or subsection 5, which was the main point, is that there's a requirement to prepare a TDM strategy to, at the time, the town satisfaction, which may include but not be limited to a number of items which were identified at the time to be the transportation demand management measures that the city was wishing to pursue, but then point R was the general and other measures as they may be identified, acknowledging that trends within this realm of the industry and technology advancements may introduce additional TDM opportunities not captured by this list. On April 16th, 2019, there was a council resolution adopted regarding proposed modifications to the Yonge and Bernard secondary plan and zoning bylaw. That council at the time sought instruments under appeal before the tribunal. Council directed staff to take a position on a number of TDM measures and other opportunities to try to reduce transportation demand management. But on May 14th, 2019, council rescinded that motion and instead directed staff to seek an adjournment of the hearing of these appeals for the purpose of undertaking a public consultation and a review process to determine what specific modifications would be appropriate within the KDA, particularly for the purpose of facilitating additional densities and building heights. In June 2019, the LPAT granted an adjournment of that hearing for that purpose. And since 2019, city staff have conducted further consultation with public agencies, including but not limited to York Region, York Regional Transit, the landowners and community regarding Yonge and Bernard secondary plan and the zoning bylaw. In September of 2019, HDR was retained by the city to start the 2020 parking and TDM strategy, as I had noted. HDR was also retained by the city in October 2019 to carry out a peer review and update to the BA group report as it pertains to the Yonge and Bernard secondary plan area as part of this secondary plan and this hearing. The resulting February 2020 draft report, or specifically the draft Yonge Bernard Key Development Area Peer Review and Transportation Assessment Update, included some parking and TDM measures within it, which I will go to. So that report, the February version of that report, can be found at tab 84. Specifically, I'll be going to page 87 through 89 through 97, and I will share my screen with that as well. I guess. lost my space. Give me a moment, please. Sorry. It actually begins on page 91. My apologies. So, as you can see here, HDR is also acknowledging that that they are performing an update to the draft parking strategy of 2010, and as part of that citywide review, they basically the city acknowledged that due to the timing of those two projects running in parallel, that this 2020 parking and TDM strategy would not be complete for the purpose of the secondary plan. However, we did acknowledge that there was an opportunity to do some preliminary analysis in order to update portions of the secondary plan. You know, and this was also based on some feedback that we had received during consultation that, you know, this opportunity should be sought after. So the specifics of the analysis, of course, I'll leave to my colleague, Mr. Chai, when he gives his testimony. I'm just going to give an overview of particulars in this report. So parking strategy identifies minimum parking rates, and I'm not going to go through the numbers, but I will note that in this nice table here, that from the 2017 to 2020, further reductions and simplifications of the parking requirements for specific land uses were proposed. And this is based on a preliminary analysis of best practices review of industry standards conducted by HDR. In general, there were reductions for residential units in the order of 13% between 2017 and 2020. You know, specific and in general, the entire table was simplified. Actually, with the formatting of this report, it fits on one page instead of crossing two. Rental units and condominium units were simplified into a single rate instead of two rates. And in general, commercial uses were lumped into consolidated rates. And that was based on some internal feedback we had received in regards to change of use after development. Limitations in the Ontario Building Code made it difficult to track those changes over time. So the process was simplified. This report also discusses maximum parking rates. This is something which is consistent with the 2010 strategy, and in general, our industry considers it also to be a transportation demand management strategy where if you limit the amount of parking that can be produced, you can slowly change behaviors away from auto dependency. It reintroduces the shared parking formula, which I had mentioned as part of the 2010 strategy, but whereas the 2010 strategy included a more complicated formula that took into account multiple versions of commercial uses, since we consolidated those uses from a parking rate standpoint, we also took this opportunity to simplify the shared parking equation. It's just a little bit easier to track since it's focused more on just the employment versus residential visitor parking. The philosophy is that you know, during the workday, people are at work and you're not visiting other people. And so the residential visitor component is underutilized during the day. And then, you know, office components not needed in the evenings. And so you can share that parking supply. You know, as I'm saying that out loud in 2020, it's not the most relevant at this exact time, but during typical driving behavior, that's the typical pattern and the philosophy behind that. They also go on to make a recommendation for car share spaces as a TDM measure. The specific to this, I guess, recommendation, I'll leave it to Mr. Chai to speak to, but it was included as part of the secondary plan. And in general, section 7.5 here, they go on to introduce an exhaustive list of TDM measures. And if you recall, this is written in a very similar format to the 2017 secondary plan where it goes through some of the TDM measures, and then it creates an exhaustive list of what ought to be required in a TDM strategy submitted to the city's satisfaction, as well as an additional list of TDM measures, which may also be included but not be limited to. And then, of course, there's a catch-all for any other measures that may be identified. So instead of providing 16 options as per 2017, we extended the list to, I guess, to offer more suggestions or more just typical practices that we've seen, so that some site-specific recommendations can be made through the development process.
So Mr. Dahl, based on that HDR report, how does that materialize itself inside the bylaw and the secondary plan that are before this tribunal?
Right, so the recommendations in regards to minimum and maximum parking are in the zoning bylaw, insofar that I can go to those. So actually, I'll stop sharing my screen while I get organized. It's just a lot of going through folders on my end. So the proposed zoning bylaw. So the proposed zoning bylaw table, I guess 5.141 lists all of the parking rates that are relevant, or all of the parking rate requirements within this KDA. And then I'll have the table from the HDR reports, and I will share my screen. Right, so the proposed bylaws on the left. I hope it's not mirrored on your screen, and the HDR reports on the right here. And so you can see the recommendations from the HDR. These are the residential rates of 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, and 1. Those are reflected in the table on the left here. And specifically going down to, I guess, non-auto, the 2.8 for generally all commercial uses is shown here. And then, you know, the 4.25 for places of assembly and so forth. I'm not going to go through number by number at this point. But the recommendations also within here of establishing maximum parking rates, which are approximately 120% of the minimum parking rate. You know, those are also reflected generally with these numbers, rounded to the closest 0.05 in general. There's a couple of exceptions, and those are historically brought forward from the 2017 zoning bylaw as it may, and just in general when you're doing certain developments such as a standalone townhouse, having a 0.25 of a driveway is not particularly useful. So it's mostly just calculations for large shared parking lots.
So Mr. Dahl, just for clarity here, comparing the bylaw that is before this tribunal today versus the version of the bylaw that was adopted back in, or passed back in 2017, in your opinion, are the standards the same, higher, or lower?
And all of the parking rates provided in the 2020 version of the bylaw are lower or equal to, so generally lower than the 2017 rates. And that was done due to an opportunity seen through the process of the 2020 parking and TDM strategy project to update those rates at that time.
Okay, Mr. Dahl, if we can now go to the secondary plan in the form that is before this tribunal for approval and go specifically to the parking policies within.
Yep. Share my screen once again. It's a good thing I practiced. So this is the 2020 version of the secondary plan, and I will specifically go to the transportation demand management section. And then I will go to the same section within the HDR report. I'm mostly just going to focus on chapter or the 5th subsection here, but you can see that the recommendation is reflected within this generally. And so, cycling infrastructure for end of trip, secure bicycle parking. You can see the list goes down to section S here, and then there's an additional list of things that may be included, but not necessarily. Unbundled parking spaces for lease agreement, for example, is something that we want considered within a mandatory like traffic demand management strategy, preferential carpool parking, and so forth. And so, we fully took the recommendation from HDR and incorporated it. We also included subsection 6 here, which makes direct reference to the car share and shared parking formula that I had mentioned briefly earlier. And so we see those opportunities as resulting in direct reductions to minimum parking rate requirements. To not prejudice the findings of the 2020 parking and TDM strategy, we have not gone on to recommend specifically what those reductions are, because that study is still ongoing. However, through a TDM strategy submitted as part of an application process, data at that point could be submitted in order to support recommendations, which would be considered on a site-by-site basis. The hope is that, or the goal of the 2020 parking and TDM strategy is to establish what those reductions would look like, and to fully refine the parking and the TDM goals that are used by the city in review of these studies.
So Mr. Dahl, if you can just get in a bit more detail as to what that forthcoming 2020 parking strategy and study is currently proposed to address. So in other words, what is the scope of that study?
Right. So the scope of the 2020 parking and TDM strategy for new developments is, in its bare minimum, it's an update to the 2010 study, and it goes on to pursue a lot of the secondary recommended goals from that study, specifically to develop a TDM strategy, which would complement that. Part of the best practice review for that study was completed in order to facilitate defining those minimum rates, which were included as part of the bylaw, and to develop that preliminary list of TDM elements for the secondary plan. However, the best practices will review for the 2020 study will also evaluate all existing bylaws and variances which have been approved in the last 10 or so years within the city. It will review the current requirements within the Richmond Hill sustainability metric, which is also a required mechanism as part of the site plan and development application process. Richmond Hill sustainability metrics. I believe that's also included in the exhibit list, but I don't have the exact tab number. It's tab 12 and 13. If you're interested. It will also include a review of the Richmond Hill and York region official plans to ensure that the policies align, which it'll review the other industry standard parking generation manuals, such as the Institute of Transportation Engineers Parking Generation Manual, which is updated frequently to reflect generally what parking trends are across North America. It will review the parking bylaws from other municipalities within the GTA, Ontario, and also some relevant ones within Canada. And it'll review the application of TDM measures and how they're applied in other parts of the country as well. A key component, and the one that is specifically impacted by COVID right now, was intended to be data collection, specifically trying to understand what the current and existing parking demands are, which is a slightly nuanced and different than parking supply, which I'll get to philosophically in a little bit. But trying to understand what the existing demands are so that you can develop trends and try to measure what the impacts of TDM are on those parking demands moving forward. So future demands and utilization. We're also wanting to take a look at bicycle demand and bicycle parking supply within the Richmond Hill context. Shifting to transit isn't the only way to meet change from auto dependency. I think active transportation, particularly in the suburbs, is often overlooked. And so looking at trends at what bicycle uptake within the city is also something we're interested in doing. But also the context of the data. It's a lot of TDM measures and parking demand in general tends to be context specific within urban form and within the greater context of where those land uses are located. There's a lot of very nuanced dependencies between land uses and infrastructure, which are quite frankly kind of difficult to measure, but we're hoping to try to seek out some of those general trends. Time of day and weather may also influence some of those decisions, and the odd pandemic of sorts. At the same time, we're also taking this as an opportunity to review the design criteria, which would be specifically the spatial requirements for a lot of these elements, including our standard parking spaces, accessible spaces, compact spaces, bicycle parking stall locations and dimensions and what have you. We'd also like to review loading and garbage requirements, although that's an interdepartment issue with respect to my other colleagues at the city, because transportation doesn't deal specifically with waste management. And so a lot of that will be an exercise of verifying, but part of the process nonetheless. But by far the most significant portion of the 2020 parking and TDM strategy is the latter part, the TDM strategy. So currently the city of Richmond Hill does not have a fully fledged out TDM strategy, which directly relates TDM elements to specific parking reductions. And so that's quite an undertaking, specifically due to the context that I was mentioning before. Different policy areas may already have some in the existing infrastructure, which could lend themselves to being supportive to certain TDM measures as is. That is, I guess, an example off the top of my head. Providing subsidized transit passes is typically more useful if you have access to transit, frequent and often transit. Or the inclusion of end of trip bicycle or shower facilities is useful for employment in order to encourage bicyclists to try to travel to your place of work by bicycle, but it wouldn't complement a residential land use that well, because you probably already have access to a shower at your home. And so having ground floor shower facilities are less important in that context.
So Mr. Dahl, notwithstanding that you've indicated the 2020 study is not completed at this point, does the secondary plan that is before this tribunal for approval, does it incorporate TDM?
It does. Yeah, the secondary plan currently, specifically the secondary plan section 12.4.3, as I had shown earlier, does address TDM from a secondary plan policy level, where it requires a TDM strategy to be submitted to the city. And at that point, a recommended TDM elements could be proposed in a way which is thoughtful to the proposed development.
And Mr.
for
Dahl,
incorporation.
sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Continue your answer.
Yeah, that was basically it. A TDM strategy could be submitted in a way which incorporates TDM measures in a way that complements the context and specifically what's being proposed.
So, Mr. Dahl, in your opinion, what approaches can be taken to parking supply as it relates to TDM?
So the way that the zoning bylaw and secondary plan are written allows flexibility to the development industry in order to propose something which I suppose in a way meets the vision of the developer, but also meets the city's vision for the secondary plan area. That is to say, there are minimums and there are maximum parking rates. Ideally, if there were to be a proposal which were to recommend anything, say that has a parking supply less than the minimum, that would need to be supported through transportation demand management measures. We specifically pointed out in subsection 6 of the secondary plan, 2 TDM measures which to date have been successful within the Richmond Hill context. That is to say car share parking spaces, to allow car sharing programs to operate within residential areas, and the consideration of a shared parking supply between office and residential visitor use. So those have had success within Richmond Hill within a transportation demand management section. And so at which point, if assuming the proposed development was fully in compliance with the policies within the area, a development could propose through the site plan application process, a minor variance on their parking supply, illustrating that they had incorporated those TDM measures, which would then be secured through that process. However, if the proposed development were to incorporate any other design elements which are not secondary plan compliant, such as setback requirements off the top of my head, at which point you could also pursue reduced parking rates through TDM measures as part of a zoning bylaw amendment, and then further refined in the site plan application process, as I understand it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dahl.
Yeah.
Is there anything further you wanted to add?
One more thing, just on the consultation intent for the 2020 parking strategy. And so when incorporating, I guess, progressive reductions in minimum parking standards and incorporating TDM elements and strategies, it's also important to have consulted with the people that may be impacted. I mean, of course it is. And so the consultation plan for that 2020 parking and TDM strategy includes consultation with internal and external stakeholders. We've identified a number here, such as York Region, adjacent local municipalities to our east and our west, in order to create some consistency on one side of a road compared to the other. We want to work together with the development industry in order to find opportunities, but then we also want to work with the residents and with the Richmond Hill Business Improvement Area representatives, so that at the end of the day things are balanced. You don't want to create a strategy which in the future may result in an undersupply of parking, which would impact the existing residents and the existing business owners. And so the approach is to do so in a thoughtful way and to encourage TDM through thoughtful development and site design in a way that the city can grow consistently. Yeah.
So, Mr. Dahl, why not simply take an approach where TDM measures are mandatory and required KDA? Why?
So I had touched on this in the past, but I guess I'll give a quick high-level description. So as we saw it when approaching the zoning bylaw and secondary plan, there was primarily two approaches that we identified that we could have taken. One was as you said, to introduce reduced parking rates and then to require TDM measures within the zoning bylaw. The other approach was to introduce updated parking rates, but then to require TDM strategy within the secondary plan, and then to support that secondary plan with an extensive list of TDM measures. For the purposes of this secondary plan and zoning bylaw, we took the second approach, but I'd just like to note like the advantages and disadvantages of both. The key disadvantage of the first approach, which is to prescribe TDM measures within the zoning bylaw, is that it assumes that those particular TDM measures are the only effective ones at accomplishing the goals within the secondary plan. And it assumes specific TDM measures could apply to the context of every development site, regardless of what's being proposed. I gave a couple of high-level examples as to the compatibility of some TDM measures to some land uses. There are of course others, and I won't get into that. But in general, we didn't want to be overly prescriptive at the zoning bylaw level because in the past that could be perceived as a potential barrier to development where even though there are access to these TDM measures in adjacent sites or within the infrastructure already, you're prescribing them to every site within a KDA. And so we thought that the second approach of generally requiring a TDM strategy and giving the opportunity to developments to incorporate those TDM measures on a site-by-site basis was more effective in order to get some thoughtful site design and in order to generate those incentives through TDM. And so in the end, we took the second approach, but I'd like to note that technically both approaches would have conformed to the relevant policies within the Yonge and Bernard secondary plan area. That is to say, both approaches, and I'm not going to flip to every reference, but I'm going to note a couple references to the Greater Growth Plan for Greater Golden Horseshoe, for example. So both approaches do support transit supportive design as per the Growth Plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, section 2.2.4.8. They both provide reduced parking standards as per that same document, section 2.2.4.9. They both integrate transportation demand management as per section 3.2.2.4. They both support the purpose of settlement areas as per Oak Ridge's Moraine Conservation Plan section 18, in the sense that they both have the potential of creating a neighborhood of a walking scale that is transit supportive. They both meet the parking management policies for regional corridors as per York Region official plan, and they both conform to transit-oriented development policies as per the City of Richmond Hill's official plan. And so it was merely just at the point of developing the secondary plan and zoning bylaw, we felt the most appropriate approach was to require that site-specific transportation demand strategy on a per-site basis, and instead to offer reduced parking rates through the initial best practices review as part of the 2020 parking and TDM strategy. That was the best approach at the time of the writing of the study. And in general, we feel that it provides a lot of flexibility to all of the proposed developments within this area.
Thank you, Mr. Dahl. Mr. Chai, as an expert from HDR, can you provide the tribunal an overview of HDR's involvement in this secondary plan and zoning bylaw as it relates to parking?
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Can you hear me? Okay, so HDR was first retained in September 2019 to undertake the 2020 Parking and Travel Demand Management Study for new developments, and I'm the project manager for that study, consultant project manager. As my colleague Mr. Dahl mentioned, it is primarily an update to the city's 2010 parking strategy. We are reviewing best practices as they relate to parking standards for residential and non-residential uses. By looking at peer municipalities, primarily in the GTA, but more extensively throughout Canada. The other scope items include collection of data, which is currently on hold right now due to the COVID-19 situation, stakeholder engagement with agency partners, as well as the development industry. We did hold we did present to Build in January 2020 with the findings of our initial best practices review as well. As Mr. Dahl mentioned as well, we are considering updating the applicability of the best practices review, or the applicability of the findings of this study, which include directly aligning TDM measures with parking and the development application process. And in addition, we'll also be identifying appropriate monitoring and follow-up protocols to guide site plan applications and the implementation process. We understand the need to ensure that the measures implemented are effective and are in fact encouraging more travel via transit, walking, cycling, and perhaps other new mobility options which may be available in the future, and each of which may help reduce parking needs on site. But the details of this process are to be determined, as we are still currently undertaking the study, and we'll still need to finalize it as time goes on. In addition, HDR was retained to carry out a peer review for the Yonge Bernard KDA, and I oversaw the analysis and recommendations as they relate to parking and TDM. And these recommendations, as Mr. Dahl has gone through, included reductions to both residential and non-residential parking, updating of the shared parking and car share formulas for parking reductions, bicycle parking, and travel demand management approaches.
So, Mr. Chai, how did you determine the rates that made their way in your HDR report and ultimately inside the bylaw that's before the tribunal?
So specifically to minimum residential parking rates, I'll start there. I'm going to share my screen and make reference to the witness statement compendium and my witness statement, specifically attachment C. And it's on page 244 of that document, which I will share on the screen.
And just for clarity, that's also in the redacted version, exhibit 24, and it's the same page numbers in the redacted version.
That's correct. Okay, so on my screen now is the first page of the parking section of that report, page 244. This list here provides an understanding of the various sources that we reviewed with respect to parking standards in other jurisdictions, primarily in the GTA, but as mentioned, we did look outside of the GTA at the City of Vancouver as well. And to guide our recommendations, I will flip to page 254 of that document in Table 1. And we more specifically considered similar jurisdictions in York Region, which in my opinion were similar to the KDA, and also along Viva Rapidways, and specifically that includes Newmarket Urban Center Secondary Plan, which is the second column there, and Markham Center. And one thing that I want to clarify for the panel are that there is a typo or an error in this table. Under Markham Center, the rates there should read 1.0 for the record. for all of the uses. So bachelor, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and 3 bedroom should all read 1.0. And the visitor rate remains the same at 0.2.
And Mr. Chai, with that correction to the Markham rates, does that have any impact on your ultimate recommendations of the parking rates in your HDR report?
No, it did not make any impact to the recommendations that we made in the HDR report. And primarily because we were starting with the 2010 parking strategy as the initial frame of reference and looking at other best practices which were more recent than the Markham bylaw. In the Markham, for clarity, the Markham bylaw was, I think it was approved or amended in 2012. And the Richmond Hill work was 2010. But the Newmarket work specifically, I think it was approved by Newmarket Council in 2018 or 19. That one we felt was more specifically relevant to guide our recommendations for the Yonge Bernard KDA. One further clarification with respect to the table in the third column under Vaughan, that should read Vaughan Metropolitan Center specifically, and that is with reference to the City of Vaughan's December 2018 bylaw 1-88. So we also included Toronto policy areas 2 and 3 in the table and Vaughan Metropolitan Center, recognizing that those are areas which have a higher level of transit service. Specifically, those areas have access to subway, the Toronto Transit Commission subway. So you can see on the right-hand column there that our recommended rates, building on that information, are shown on the right hand of the screen. There's 0.7 for bachelor, 0.8, 0.9, and 1 for 1, 2, and 3 bedroom, and 0.15 for visitor.
And Mr. Chai, why did you view the comparator sites that you selected as comparable sites or comparable areas?
So firstly, with respect to Newmarket and Markham Center, those are jurisdictions within York Region, similar to Richmond Hill. And Newmarket, as specifically in the urban centers secondary plan area, is similar in growth policies or intensification policies to the Yonge Bernard KDA. As well, it is located along Aviva Rapid Way. So similar level of transit service to support these recommendations, essentially. I will add also that the best practices review did look at the alignment of TDM and parking, and those policies were identified in other jurisdictions, specifically in the city of Vancouver. In section 7.5 of the HDR report, so on screen now is page 249. And on page 249 and page 250 is an extensive list of TDM measures, which is comprehensive, but I would add that it is not exhausted, and on a site-specific basis, it is our recommendation that other TDM measures may be considered to be reviewed at the discretion of the city.
And Mr. Chai, did you make any recommendations regarding maximum parking rates?
Yes, so with respect to maximum parking rates, we recommended to carry forward the recommendations of the 2010 parking strategy, which is basically that maximum rates should be 25% higher than the minimum rates.
And in terms of bicycle parking, what were your recommendations?
So with respect to minimum bicycle parking rates, we recommended that they align with what was identified in Bylaw 111-17. And I will bring up a reference, which is tab 71 of the joint document book. And I'm sharing that on screen right now. The The recommended rates in bylaw 111-17, I don't have that on screen right now, but the tab 71 shows supporting information for that. So in order to justify those rates, we looked at similar bicycle parking rates in other jurisdictions. Again, looking at Newmarket, Vaughan, Markham, and Toronto. But we did also look at other jurisdictions such as Hamilton, Vancouver, Oakville, and Ottawa. But generally speaking, on a per residential unit basis, bylaw 111-17 recommends 0.6 per bicycle parking spaces per residential unit. Considering our best practices analysis, we saw a range in these peer municipalities of 0.5 to 0.8, specifically among peer municipalities in York Region. You can see for long-term, so long-term in what you see on screen there, long-term refers to the specific residential units, and short-term refers to visitor parking. So you can see Markham recommends 0.5, Toronto 0.9, Newmarket 0.5, Vaughan 0.8 as examples of that range of 0.5 to 0.8. When it comes to non-residential parking, bylaw 111-17 recommends 0.13 spaces per 100 meters square of gross floor area. And considering our best practices review of that, we saw ranges from 0.1 to 0.5 spaces per unit. In bylaw 111-17 provides the lower end of the scale at 0.13. So I won't. Well, maybe I will. A lot of numbers on that screen there, but generally speaking, that was the range that we see in there on a per 100 meter square unit basis, 100 meters square gross floor area basis. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chai. Any concluding remarks as it relates to your HDR report, the parking portion?
So in conclusion, it is my professional opinion that the parking and TDM recommendations set forth in the HDR report are appropriate to guide development in the KDA at the secondary plan level, specifically because they align with area-wide rates of similar growth areas in peer municipalities with similar levels of transit service, and further that they will allow for site-specific transportation and TDM plans to further justify reduced parking on site as outlined by the applicant on a site-specific basis.
Thank you, sir. I'm now going to turn to the issues on the issues list. And maybe just for a matter of expedience, and since we're here, we go to issue regarding bicycle parking. Are the bicycle parking standards appropriate?
Mr. Tahar?
Yep. Oh, sure. Apologies, sir.